A man was living alone in the midst of silence. Until one day, a girl covered in blood knocked on his door. The next morning, 70 warriors surrounded his home. But no one knew this wasn't just a threat. This was a story about a man confronting his past, a girl facing her destiny, and a people fighting for their honor. If you enjoy stories filled with deep, real emotions like this one, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and like this video to support us. Because here, we don't just tell stories, we weave time, heart, and silence together. When Daniel Grayson put his rusty tea mug on the windowsill, the sky was starting to darken into a pale purple. The wind made the old wooden house shudder, slapping everything left outside. His graying beard stretched down from his chin, and his tired shoulders looked crushed by the weight of all those years. 3 winters ago, after he buried his wife, this cabin had become home not just to him, but to all their memories too. The old scarf his wife had knitted still hung over the back of a kitchen chair. Little jars of dried herbs were gathering dust on the shelves. Since that day, Daniel had slept alone, always on the left side of the bed, leaving the right side empty. People in town called him the quiet madman. Once a month, he would go down just to get what he needed, never saying hello to anyone, just doing his shopping and heading home. Daniel hadn't really stopped talking, there just wasn't anyone left to talk to. That night, he heard a sound carried in by the wind. At first he thought it was a fox, then maybe a coyote, but the sound was too human to be an animal. Out of habit, he grabbed his rifle and stepped onto the porch. His fingers were numb from the cold, but his instincts were still sharp. In front of the barn, lying curled up in the snow, he saw a shape. At first, in the dark, he couldn't make it out. But then it became clear, a thin girl. Her clothes were torn to shreds, her right arm soaked in blood from shoulder to wrist. Her feet were bare, and she wasn't moving. Daniel stood there, frozen for a moment. His eyes widened. It was like a ghost from the past had fallen into the earth. He didn't touch the trigger. He lowered the rifle slowly, and he picked her up. The girl was almost weightless. It was like what he was carrying wasn't just flesh, but the shell of a soul that had been taken away. She was burnt with the freezing cold from outside, but her body was still warm. Daniel carried her inside, into that old house he used to share with his wife, the place he'd never let anyone else enter, a silent, ash-filled home. He laid her down in front of the fireplace, found the only blanket in the house that didn't carry the scent of old memories, and wrapped her up. The girl's lips were cracked. Her breath was barely there. Her eyes were half open, whispering some kind of dream language. Daniel couldn't understand her words, but what he felt wasn't fear, more like a call for help. This wasn't just someone who was hurt. This was someone who was being hunted. He cleaned her wound. Quietly, using the old methods he'd learned in the war, he stitched her up. The bleeding had stopped, but the girl was still out of it. She only shuddered once when the needle went in. But she never spoke. He didn't either. Words weren't needed then. Without even looking at each other, a different kind of understanding was born between them. After the girl fell asleep, Daniel went outside and washed his hands in the snow. The moon was up. The wind had eased. He stood beside that old bench, Marlene's favorite spot. But the flowers didn't grow there anymore. Just before sunrise, the girl woke up. She sat up fast, her eyes full of panic. Daniel didn't touch her. He just pointed at the plate with some bread and dried meat he'd left. The girl took it cautiously, like a wild animal. She bit off a piece and chewed slowly. She wasn't using one side of her teeth. Maybe there was a hidden bruise on her face. But Daniel didn't ask. She didn't explain either. "You're safe here," Daniel said, his voice raspy and heavy from not being used. The girl didn't answer, but she didn't run, either. That day, the snow got even heavier. Daniel went out to the barn to tend the animals. When he came back, the fireplace was cleaned, the blanket was folded. The girl was wandering the kitchen shelves, searching for something, with a look that showed hunger without asking for it. That night, Daniel made a stew: meat, salt, beans, and a little dried onion. The girl ate slowly. Every move was careful, as if this wasn't just a meal, but a ritual. That night, he gave her his bed. He tried to sleep in his chair, but he couldn't. Around midnight, when he opened his eyes, the girl was at the window, scanning the horizon. There was a sense of waiting for danger inside the silence. "Is someone coming?" Daniel asked. The girl turned and looked at him. Then she nodded just once. Yes, Daniel had seen a lot of storms in his life, but this had no name. It was like a curse someone else carried, but now it was at his doorstep. The girl turned and went to the fire. He got up too, grabbed the blanket from the chair, and handed it to her. "Stay tonight. We'll figure things out in the morning," he said. The girl looked at him. There was no fear in her eyes, and no trust either. But she didn't leave. That night, by the fire, the two strangers, one trapped in the past, the other in the future, slowly began to blend together in the quiet. And the next morning, when Daniel stepped outside, he saw fresh horse tracks circling in the snow. The morning was quiet, unusually so. The birds hadn't sung. The wind had stopped. The air felt heavy, like someone had pressed down on the silence. When Daniel headed to the barn, at first the tracks in the snow didn't make sense. But then he realized these weren't just from one horse, but from many, maybe 20, maybe 50. They had circled the cabin, forming a ring. This wasn't an arrival, it was a siege. He slowly walked back to the house, closed the door quietly. Leona was still by the fire, wrapped in a blanket. But her eyes were open. They looked at each other. Daniel didn't say anything. He didn't need to. She understood. The danger was now just outside their door. He reached for his gun, the old Winchester above the door. His hand went to the barrel, but he didn't take it down. He stopped himself. This wasn't something a bullet would fix anymore. Instead, he threw a few more logs on the fire. The girl stood up, her elbows still bandaged, but she stood firm. She had braided her hair back, gotten ready quietly. She no longer looked like a refugee, but like someone who'd made a decision. And then the moment came. On the horizon, small black dots started to appear, slowly. The shapes grew as they approached, coming out of the wind. Horses, dozens of them. There wasn't a single sound on the snow. No shouting, no hoofbeats. It was like the earth itself accepted this journey in silence. At their head rode a man. He was tall, wrapped in a black wolf pelt, feathers woven into his hair and his horse's mane. His face was painted red with lines running from his cheeks down to his chin like the tears of war. His eyes were deep, determined, merciless. But he didn't shout. He'd come with dozens of warriors, but he was silent. And that silence said more than any scream could. Daniel opened the door. Leona stood beside him. She didn't back down. The men formed a perfect circle around the cabin. No one drew a weapon, no spears were raised. But the air was thick, ready to explode like gunpowder. The man in the black pelt slowly took off the mask from his face. When Daniel looked into his eyes, all he saw was history and loss. But there was also something he recognized: honor and anger. Leona quietly stepped forward. Daniel almost stopped her, but changed his mind. The girl took a step ahead and spoke just one word: "Father." Time stopped. The warriors didn't move. Neither did their leader. But their eyes focused on the girl, then turned to Daniel. Daniel didn't say a word. It wouldn't have mattered if he had. This was a moment for looks, stances, and memories, not words. The father got down from his horse. He walked forward, slow and steady. Daniel didn't move. When they stood almost side by side, Leona stepped between them. "I'm not going back," she said, her voice slow but unshakable. "I didn't run away. I survived." The man paused. He looked at his daughter, then at Daniel. "You hit her," he said. "No," Daniel replied. "I just opened the door. She did the rest." After a short silence, the father took a small knife from his pocket. It looked like an antique, the handle worn, but the blade still gleamed dangerously. Daniel tensed on instinct. But the man just pointed at his daughter. "You're not a child anymore," he said. "And still, I want to decide for you." That was wrong. Leona stepped forward. "I'm not a thing," she said. "I can choose now." The man closed his eyes. 3 days, he said. "I'll come back in 3 days. Not as a father, but as a chief." Then he mounted his horse. So did his men. There were no weapons drawn. But the words were clearer than any weapon. 3 days. Peace or a storm. And all that was left were the tracks of horses. Daniel turned to the girl. She was staring at the horizon. There was no fear in her eyes. But there was the weight of a decision. Some days are longer than you expect, especially when decisions have been made. But the results haven't arrived yet. Daniel woke up early. Snow had fallen again overnight, but now every track stayed in place. The circular tracks of 70 horses were still there on top of the snow, an unbroken threat. It was quiet outside, but inside, it was as loud as Judgment Day. Leona hadn't woken up yet. Or maybe she was awake, but keeping her eyes closed. Daniel brewed coffee. He noticed his hands were shaking. Not from the cold, but from uncertainty. The chief's words still echoed in his head. 3 days. That wasn't a period of time, it was a countdown. That day passed quietly. Daniel focused on the farm chores. He checked the fences, fed the animals, shoveled snow. Everything was the same, but nothing was the same. Leona was quiet too. But Daniel noticed. She moved around the house differently now. Before, she used to stay in the corners like a guest. Now she was in the kitchen, organizing one of the shelves, sorting herbs, kneading bread. There was no sense of ownership, but there was a sense of belonging. In the afternoon, when Daniel came in from the yard, Leona was kneeling on the floor in front of the fireplace, holding a piece of string. She was weaving thin, long strips of leather. He didn't ask what she was doing. He didn't need to. Every movement was a story already. Her story. Marjorie, Leona said, her voice soft but clear. Daniel tried to understand for a second. Your wife's name, she added. Daniel bowed his head. Yes, he said. Marjorie. He hadn't said that name in a long time. Saying it felt like the name left a sound hanging in the air. It was a moment blessed by silence. The next day, Leona took that old scarf and folded it at the end of the bed. The scarf Marjorie had knitted years ago. Instead, she started using the blanket from the back of the chair. That tiny detail left a lump in Daniel's throat. The girl respected the past, but as she found her place, she didn't trample on it. She was quietly creating a new balance in the house. They talked more that day. Short, simple sentences, but each one was as clear as water. Daniel showed her how to track animals. Rabbit tracks in the snow, direction, slope. Leona showed him the different knots her people used. Not to tie an animal, but almost as if tying to a sound. Sometimes they just sat side by side, not talking. There was no sound but the crackle of the fire. But this silence was different from the first day. Now, the silence was like a shared room, not a distance. That evening, Daniel put a small piece of cloth he'd brought from town on the table. Leona slowly reached out, running her finger over the fabric. She didn't say a word, but for the first time, there was a glimmer of gratitude in her eyes. Silent, but endless thanks. That night, Leona began to sew the fabric. Even when she pricked her finger, she worked without saying a word. In the light of the fire, that blue fabric turned into a tunic. It was an identity shaped by her own hands, her own decision. Not a garment of her old people anymore, but a symbol of her own choice. Daniel watched her every move, but without making it obvious. In her, there was motherhood, childhood, warrior spirit, and something else. A decision. The name of that decision hadn't been spoken yet, but Daniel saw in her eyes not just fear anymore, but freedom. Toward morning, he saw new tracks by the door. They were close, but they hadn't come yet. They were waiting. The third day was almost here. Time felt like a heartbeat, not like a clock. And with every tick of those hours, Daniel made another decision. He wasn't alone anymore. Now, he carried not just the weight of the past, but the possibility of a future. That night, he turned to Leona and asked for the first time, "What's your name?" The girl stopped. Her eyes were bright, but dark at the same time. "Leona," she said. Her voice was like a small lamp being lit in a dark room. Daniel repeated the name, Leona, and in that moment, something new was born inside the cabin. Not love, not friendship, a deep, unnamed bond. Daniel spoke his heart. "I don't know what this is, but it's not just silence anymore." Leona bowed her head. "Maybe," she said, "this is just the beginning." The third morning was gray. The sky was the color of lead. The snow still hadn't melted, but it had softened. The cold went deep. Now it wasn't the body, but the thoughts that were shivering. Daniel had woken up at first light, but waking up was no longer an obligation, it was acceptance. He pushed the quilt aside, put his feet on the floor, and stared at the window. It felt as if a shadow, a figure, might appear there. But no one had come yet. Leona was getting ready quietly. She had braided her hair tightly, put on the blue tunic she'd sewn, tied her waist with leather cords. She looked at the wound on her arm, removed the bandage underneath. The stitches had healed cleanly, but a scar remained. That scar was a silent witness to where she'd run from, what she'd lived through, and the moment she was about to face. Daniel looked at her. He didn't ask what she was going to do. He already knew the answer. This girl hadn't come here just to hide. She'd tasted freedom here, and now she would stand before her own people to defend it. Running away was not an option today, and by now, Daniel knew her well enough not to say run to her. They drank coffee together. They didn't talk, but the silence wasn't a lack anymore, it was preparation. Inside, A sentence kept repeating in Daniel's mind. I can't keep you here, but I can stand by you. By noon, as the sky darkened, the wind changed. It was no longer cool, but threatening. Even the tone of the air was different. This was the silence before a decision, not a storm. Then the ground trembled. In the distance, the riders appeared first like a wave. This time, they didn't form a circle, they came in a straight line. Their posture had changed. They were more determined, less merciful than before. Tarek Leona's father was at the front, in the same pelt, the same stance. But the lines on his face were deeper now. When Daniel saw him, he saw both a father and a leader. But now, there weren't words between them, only decisions. Daniel stepped outside, unarmed, just wearing his coat, hands empty, but standing tall. Leona walked beside him. Both of them seemed free from their shadows. The chief and the warriors stopped a few meters away. Again, silence. But this time, the silence was more tense, sharper. Tarek raised his hand. The warriors dismounted. No weapons were drawn, but the tension on their shoulders was sharper than any sword. Tarek stepped forward. 3 days, he said, his voice thick but steady. It's over. Now she will return. Daniel stepped forward. She might be your daughter, but she made a decision. Tarek narrowed his eyes. She is part of our people. Her leaving is not just a loss, but a challenge. And a challenge is either accepted or punished. Leona stepped out from Daniel's side. She was no longer standing behind him. She looked her father in the eye. I may be your blood, but I'm not walking your path anymore, she said. Those words hung in the air like a sword. There was a murmur among the warriors, but Tarek silenced them with his hands. Who is this man to you? He asked. A stranger? A refuge? Leona took a deep breath. A door. And I chose to walk through that door. Tarek's eyes didn't fill with tears, his voice didn't tremble. But something inside him cracked as a father. He drew a knife-decorated, ceremonial. He walked step by step. Daniel tensed, but Leona stopped him with her hand. Tarek placed the knife in his daughter's hands. Then defend yourself. But this will be a decision not just for you, but for all of us. Daniel spoke. We don't have to fight. Neither of us is forcing her. But we don't want her to leave either. Tarek bowed his head slightly. Then I have to see how strong you are. His eyes fixed on Daniel. Tomorrow, on the hunt, just the two of us. One target, one decision. Leona held her breath. This wasn't a duel. It was a test. Another way to earn respect. Daniel nodded. Tomorrow, he said. I'm ready. The riders turned. They withdrew like shadows. But this time, the wind left behind not a threat, but a sense of curiosity. What would happen? 2 men going out to hunt, one for the girl he loved, the other for his daughter's honor. Which one wouldn't come back? Daniel turned to Leona. He didn't ask, Are you ready? Because she had already made her choice. She had chosen not just her name, but her own fate. And that night, for the first time, they didn't lie awake out of fear, but out of anticipation. Daniel woke before dawn. He thought he'd slept, but in truth he hadn't closed his eyes at all. It was still dark outside, the air still weary. Leona was still asleep, or at least her eyes were closed, because Daniel knew she'd been awake all night too. He got dressed quietly. He laced up his old boots, the kind that didn't make a sound on barren ground. He didn't take his rifle, because this hunt would be made not with weapons, but with silence. When he opened the door and stepped out, Tarek was already there. Alone. No warriors, no lookouts. Just him and the wind. He was holding a bow. On his broad shoulders he carried the weight of years, and in his eyes, the language of the past. Are you ready? He asked. Daniel nodded. I'm ready. They walked, not riding horses, like men following the trail of the wind. The silence between them was no longer a threat, it was the mutual understanding that comes before a test. Tarek walked ahead. Daniel followed his tracks. Across barren hills, plains covered in dry grass, and slopes that blushed with the first red light of sunrise, they walked. The hunt wasn't just about finding an animal. For Tarek, this was about measuring the man before him. Was he patient enough to protect his daughter? Strong enough to stand tall in silence? Every step Daniel took carried his own past. Steps that had come through war, through his wife's grave, through the shadows. A few hours later, at the edge of a valley, they found a trail. In the mud covered with snow, for fresh hoof prints. Tarek crouched down. A young male? Still fast. Daniel only nodded. Tarek stepped back, leaving the first move of the hunt to him. Daniel checked the bow. just as Leona had shown him a few days before. The string was taut, the feathers balanced. He moved forward, hands pressed into the snow, just as he'd crept up on wounded soldiers in the war silently, carefully. His eyes caught a movement behind the bushes. The deer was there, young but wary, eyes wide like stars. Daniel didn't even breathe. When the arrow left the bow, the air itself seemed to hold its breath. And then silence. The deer dropped where it stood. No cry of pain, no attempt to flee. A clean shot. The arrow had gone in just behind the heart, tearing through the lung. The deer slowly folded to its knees, then lay down. Daniel closed his eyes. Forgive me, he thought. This was not just a test, it was also a thank you. Tarek had been standing behind, watching. He didn't applaud, didn't praise, but he bowed his head in silence. You struck true, he said. You didn't hesitate. Not to kill it, Daniel said. To show you. Tarek was quiet for a long time. Then he leaned down and touched the deer's antlers. For us, a hunt is more than feeding our bellies. It's like a word, and you said it right. Together, they carried the deer back. As they walked, Tarek glanced at Daniel again. Your eyes are darkened not by fear, but by loss, he said. There's a difference. A man who fears, defends. A man who has lost, protects. They said nothing on the way home, but Daniel realized something. Tarek now walked beside him not as Leona's father, but as a man. Their steps matched. Their shadows merged. When they reached the cabin, Leona was waiting at the door. There was no panic in her eyes, but she was tired. When their eyes met, Daniel nodded. It's over, he said. But the story hasn't even begun. Tarek walked to his daughter. From inside his coat, he pulled out a small pouch. Inside, there was a necklace made of black stones. It was one her mother used to wear. You're no longer of my fire, he said, but you're not erased from my heart. He placed the necklace in her hand. Leona closed her eyes for a moment, folded her hands over her chest. This wasn't peace, but it was a sign of acceptance. Daniel watched them both. In his eyes there was neither victory nor defeat, only belonging. Tarek turned, mounted his horse again, and those 70 warriors left the valley without ever drawing a sword or making a threat. Daniel and Leona stood quietly in front of the door for a while. Even the wind was silent. The hunt was over, but the courtyard of a new life was just opening. Morning arrived with the sky washed clean by the storm. For the first time, the sun warmed the snow, and everything around the house looked clearer than ever before. The sky had turned blue. A light mist was rising, and the light falling on the fresh snow felt like the first line of a new page. Daniel looked outside from the cabin window. This must be what it's like to wake up to a morning that promises spring. Leona was quietly boiling tea in the kitchen. She no longer moved like a stranger in this house, but as someone settled in. Every step she took bore the mark of a decision, a choice. Daniel looked at her. Her presence was no longer that of a refugee or a guest. She was a companion, a partner. And Leona had proved that not with a ring or with words, but with silence. With meeting his gaze. By staying. Daniel took something from the small chest by the fireplace. A small gift wrapped in old fabric, a necklace made of 3 bone beads, passed down from his mother. He'd kept it for a long time, never knowing what to do with it. Now its time had come. He placed it on the table. Leona came over. She picked up the necklace. She didn't ask. She didn't say thank you. But the light in her eyes spoke something beyond words. This gift meant, I choose you. Simple, silent, but endless. That day, Daniel saddled his horse. But this time he wasn't alone. Leona was ready too. Her blue tunic, a decorated belt at her waist, fur-lined boots on her feet. She stood beside him. Are we going to town? She asked. Daniel nodded. We have something to explain. They set out together. The horses walked side by side. The wind no longer blew against their faces, but at their backs as if it was pushing them, supporting them. The road was covered in snow, but it wasn't muddy, just soft with resistance. Each step erased the traces of the past and left new ones. When they arrived in town, people watched them. There was no fear on Leona's face. Daniel's shoulders carried not shame, but pride. Miss Lahi was waiting for them in front of the store, arms crossed, brows furrowed. So you brought her back? She said. Daniel didn't answer. Leona stepped forward. I wasn't brought back, she said. I stayed. I chose. A murmur ran through the town. The old man in front of the shop leaned on his cane. A small child hid behind his mother. But no one spoke. because what needed to be said was already there in Leona's eyes. Daniel went inside, bought coffee, sugar, and flour. As he paid, he added one more sentence. "We'll be getting married in the spring." That sentence changed the air in the shop. Some whispered, some raised their eyebrows. But after a pause, Miss Lahi just said, "Well, good luck to you." They didn't talk on the way home. There was no need. The road was carrying them home, now to a house that had meaning for both of them. The days followed one after the other. Leona now went out into the yard, fed the chickens, and started a small garden behind the cabin. Daniel repaired the fences and found the courage to hang old photos on the walls. One day, Daniel sat with a small piece of wood in his hand, slowly carving something, a tiny cradle. Leona watched him from the shade. Her eyes didn't fill with tears, but something spilled out across her face as if rising from deep inside. Her hands rested on her belly. A new silence was being born, but this time not from pain, from life. Daniel looked up. "My shadow feels lighter now," he said, "because I'm not carrying it alone." Leona came closer. She placed her hand in his. "You didn't leave your past in the grave," she said. "You transformed it." That night, as they sat in front of the fire, there was no longer silence between them, but a song. It had no melody, no words, but it echoed inside them, like a language born from two different peoples, two broken souls, two lonelinesses. Wordless, but full of meaning. And the stars in the sky seemed closer than ever. This story ends here, but their story is just beginning.